Good morning to my vast number of followers. Kidding. This is the politically incorrect old white guy back again with another in the series of discussions on government in this rather turbulent era. So today, I think it's probably appropriate to recap some of what we've covered, and then we'll pick up on some items we discussed last time when we looked at socialism in Scandinavia. And then we'll move into a discussion of who pays. We talked a lot about government providing stuff last time, and that's one aspect of the discussion. What stuff is appropriate, what stuff makes sense for government to provide. And then, of course, someone has to pay, so we can talk about that, and especially about this concept of fair share that we hear so often. Okay, so to recap, I have made the series of assertions or statements. The first is government will fail you. And I've given examples of that in each session, and I will give another one today. Specifically, I'll talk about the FEMA efforts in North Carolina, or lack thereof. Then we stated that government is, well, I guess in summary, the reason government fails you is they don't hire the best and they don't fire the worst. And they also lack accountability for anything measurable. The second assertion I made was that government is a leaky bucket, and that's because they are working with other people's money, namely your money and my money, and lots of it. And in those situations, anyone who's spending someone else's money isn't going to be as prudent as the poor sucker that slaved to make the money in the first place. We then stated that government is nonetheless necessary, at least to some degree. And, that's just a fact of modern society. You need law and order. We need some national defense. We need postal services, et cetera, items that are not easily or economically provided by the private sector. Items that everybody needs and nobody wants to pay for. Then we moved on to a discussion of, what does one do in that circumstance? And the assertion was that one keeps government as small as absolutely possible and as close as possible to the people that pay for that foot the bill, namely taxpayers. So in the exploration of small as possible, there's a spectrum of views on that, and we hear often about Scandinavia being the ideal model. We looked at Scandinavian countries and what they do and do not provide centrally through government, and we came up with the next truism, which is that there is no free stuff, there's just other people's stuff. So that's pretty much where we ended up last session, and now the discussion shifts to, okay, to the extent that there is other people's stuff, how is all that funded in terms of paying taxes? But before we get to that, here's our failure of the day. And bear with me because I seem to have lost that screen. So I'm going to have to find it again. Let's see if we can find that. Has to do with the disastrous showing by FEMA in New Hampshire. And there's been a lot of discussion about that in the press. FEMA stated pretty much as the disaster was happening that they didn't have sufficient funds. Various people said, well, they would have had funds if they hadn't spent it on the migrants. And apparently, the sums of money are staggering. The amount of money that FEMA has at its disposal is in the billions, something like $30 billion. Here you have it on the screen, 29.5 billion in 2023, 23,000 employees, and they're supposed to help people before, during, and after disasters. Before we get into the allegations flying around, let's just look at how they're organized. As with most government agencies, they're not organized by state. They don't have 50 offices. These people have 10. And it's very similar to what we've seen with other government agencies. They cut the country up into chunks: the Southeast, the South, California and surrounding, the Northwest, the Midwest, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I guess that's the Midwest. That's the Rocky Mountain region. Which again comes back to my theory that we don't need 50 states, we only need 10. But let's put that aside for the moment and talk about FEMA and North Carolina. So everybody knew this hurricane was coming. And I guess they underestimated how much rain would fall in that part of the world, and the flooding that ensued wiped out all of the infrastructure and much of the housing and what have you, and the residents were left without services, no water, no telecommunications, no power for days on end, and apparently for days on end, FEMA didn't show. And in what must be one of the greatest PR blunders of all times, Mayorkas, the guy that runs Homeland Security, which oversees FEMA, that's part of his jurisdiction, came out and said, well, we're not going to have enough money this year. And then, of course, people dug into that and they found that FEMA had spent $600 million on illegal migrants, providing them with free stuff, which is really questionable as to whether that's part of their mandate. I mean, helping people before, during, and after disasters. First of all, the people they're supposed to help are the citizens and taxpayers of the United States, not illegal immigrants. And second, them showing up here unannounced and without the proper paperwork is not a disaster. That's in fact, for them, it's like something to celebrate. I suppose for some of the residents of these towns where they've been deposited, it's a disaster, but it's not a natural disaster. So they should butt out. There's no way they should be involved in that. And then FEMA, spent a lot of time explaining that, but that's a separate bucket of money that doesn't affect our ability to deal with natural disasters. Well, it obviously does, because they didn't deal with the natural disaster that took place in North Carolina. And when you dig further, you'll see that FEMA's motto has been like a lot of other things in government, has been subject to the woke treatment. And now they're saying their priorities are diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything they do, in every aspect of, the people they help and the people they within their organization. So they're focused on that ideology. And then climate change is number 2, which is staggering. FEMA is not going to be able to do anything about climate change. And then finally, helping people in case of disasters, which they seem to have failed dismally in doing. This is not the only time. So that's our government failure of the day. I'm sure you can find plenty written about it online. And it is just another example of how government, how good they are taking your money and then, falling flat on their face. And, the only people that seem to benefit from all this money are the coddled employees of the organization, who, by the way, were supposedly, during the days immediately following the disaster, they were sitting in expensive hotels waiting for direction. And that also happened in Hawaii when the fire happened. When was that? A year ago. Most of the aid seemed to be aid to the Hilton and Hyatt hotels in the form of a flock of FEMA people just sitting there and sitting at the bar, enjoying themselves rather than doing anything real on the ground. Okay, so having said that, let's change gears a little bit and talk about this concept of fair share. If you're going to have government provide goods and services as they do in Scandinavian countries, free healthcare, free education, etc., and as we do here also to some degree, then since these things don't grow on trees, somebody has to pay. And the question is, well, by what formula? And you hear a lot of talk about fair share in this political rhetoric that flies around. You hear frequently that, though, these people aren't paying their fair share, those people should pay their fair share, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let's think about that for a second. If a group of people decide that they want to buy something collectively, the most fair arrangement would be for each person to chip in equally. So if there are 10 people and they buy something worth $100, then each pays 10, and that's fair. That's fair share. And there's no aspect of socialism in that formula at all. Well, what happens if some of these 10 people, don't make as much money as the others or make no money at all? How do we proceed? Well, if the group is so inclined, I guess they could come up with a plan whereby each person pays a share, a prorated share, depending on how much money they make. And some might pay $15 and some might pay $5. The more well-off pay the 15 and the less well-off pay the 5, or the old people pay $2.50 and the kids are free and the working people have to shoulder that. So now maybe they're paying 20 in this scheme. That's very often the case in most countries, actually, when you talk about sales tax. Sales tax is not a fair scheme in the sense that everyone pays the same sales tax. The people that have more end up paying more because they buy more. So, and if you buy more expensive stuff, you end up paying a bigger share than someone who's just getting by day to day. And in many of those schemes, sales tax schemes, VAT schemes, basic goods are exempt, food, for example, and luxury goods are taxed at a higher rate. So that now gets into a more aggressive form of redistribution, if you like, where they're taking now they're putting more of the burden on the productive citizens, and that's helping the less fortunate, some as they're called, or less productive, depending on your philosophy. And there's a transfer going on there. There's a redistribution, which is something else, a word that socialists like to use a lot. That's not sufficient for most industrial societies. Most industrial societies have gone a step further, and they've implemented a system called progressive taxation, where your income is taxed not at a fixed percentage, flat tax, even though some people propose that. It's taxed at an ever higher rate. So people who earn a low amount of money, a small amount of money, pay maybe 10% of that, or 5% in federal taxes or government taxation. And people that make 100,000 may pay effectively 20%. People that make $1 million might pay 40%. So now you're into some more aggressive form of redistribution, where government is leaning much more heavily on higher earners. And that's the case in the United States today, where some ridiculous percentage, I think it's 80% are paid of the federal revenues are paid by the top 5% of earners. So we have a very aggressive, almost one would say socialist, redistributive taxation system in the United States. It's not evident in Scandinavia. In Scandinavia, as we saw last time, even the modest income earners are paying 50% because they need a lot of money to provide all this free stuff, and there just aren't enough rich people in any country to shoulder the cost of everything. And that's ironic, because we keep hearing that in the United States that the millionaires and billionaires are not paying their fair share. That's absolute bunk. They're paying way more than their fair share, but under any definition of the word. What upsets them is that these people get lenient treatment on investment income in the form of dividends. The dividends are taxed at a lower rate, and then capital gains are not taxed until they're realized, which in some cases is only when the person dies. So there's this narrative going around that all these rich people pay less a percentage than their secretaries, which may be true for Warren Buffett and 3 other people, but it's not true for most people who earn their money the old-fashioned way, i.e., by hard work and being paid for their skills. Lawyers, doctors, all of these surgeons, all of these people paid through the nose, believe me. So much for the whole discussion on fair share. It's really a form of whenever someone says fair share, you look out, because they're not talking about fair share. They're talking about confiscatory taxation schemes. There's even been some talk about limiting the amount of money that any one individual can own. They're now talking about forcing people to pay capital gains on gains that are not realized. So if your family farm is now worth a lot of money, and you've been in the family for generations, you now suddenly have to find $1 million and to pay into the communal coffer because you are, quote unquote, not paying your fair share. I've also heard the term fair share applied in the context of labor union discussions, and the recent strike by the dock workers. Our aspiring first female, black, or whatever candidate for president has said that all those profits that are being made by the shipping companies need the dock workers are entitled to a fair share of that. That's just bullshit. Excuse my French. If you want a share of the profits of a company, invest money and become a shareholder, and then you will get, believe me, you will get your fair share of the profits of the company. As an employee, you're not entitled to any share in the profits of the company. You're entitled to the wages and or bonuses that you agreed to accept when you went to work for the company. So these people must stop with their rhetoric. This is just divisive, and it's class warfare is what it is. These people are trying to rile up class warfare, which is not good and has never been good for any society. It's just bunk. So let's come back to some of the other topics. Having said that, it leaves open the question as to what I'm proposing for the United States in terms of reform in the fairness of taxation. Let's come back and look at a couple of points from last session. We talked about France being the country in Europe that has the highest percentage of government involvement in the economy, and here you see it. French governments their spending constitutes 56.4% of the economy, forecast to be 56.8 this year, and they're trying to bring it down, but it's not coming down. Entitlements never easy to get rid of. They tax people 43% on average. Therefore, they're out of pocket and have to borrow this amount of money. I think that should add up. Well, it doesn't for some reason. And their debt, of course, keeps growing. 109, 112, 114% of, this is not dollars, this is percent of the GDP. It's not the highest in the world, but it's getting up there. And France, because of this growing debt, the debt rating agencies are downgrading France, and they're cutting it to AA- from AA, which is the same rating that Belgium and the Czech Republic get, which is not anywhere near to the top rating. And again, this free stuff other people's money has a way of running out, as Margaret Thatcher said, and eventually you get into a situation where there just isn't enough money to pay for the free stuff. And that's when things get interesting. Either there's some sort of reset, and that's usually an economic collapse, or there might be some sort of civil war or revolution. The French have cut off the heads of the aristocracy before, and it's not it's not unimaginable that might happen again, even in a modern Western economy. So much for France. Let's now look at the good news. Last time we looked at Norway and their national debt. There's a lot of graphs here. Let's find a simpler one. Here we go. There has no national debt, it turns out, because their sovereign wealth fund, these are stocks and bonds and real estate and such that are owned by the government, exceeds their debt by a substantial margin. And they're now, this was back in 2022, they're even wealthier now than they were. They've invested this oil money in various foreign. They're not allowed to invest in domestic investments because that creates a risk of favoritism and corruption, which is kind of interesting. So it's all invested in foreign securities, bonds, real estate, etc. And you can see how the value of their portfolio has skyrocketed since 1998, which isn't that long ago. And by 2022, it was $1.4 trillion. Here you see that it's now reached the point where Norway's sovereign wealth means it never has to borrow. This is in krona, and they say convert to US dollars, and it's now $1.8 trillion. They own stocks in Nokia, which I think is a Swedish company. They own stock in NVIDIA. They own stock in Apple. They own stock in Microsoft. They just, made a bunch of investments that have paid off, and they now have $1.8 trillion and growing by the second. And it must be the only country in the world that has a net asset position. The government's total financial assets exceed the total debt. And they actually borrow money, and then they use it to invest in the sovereign wealth fund, and they come out ahead. So that's one smart or fortunate situation for the people of Norway. Now, remember that the population is only 5 million people. So how this happened is not because they're socialist or socialist leaning. This happened because you've got a small number of people sitting on an enormous oil reserve, and the government took the money and invested it in wisely, it turns out, and they have while they do have national debt, I mean, this asset, it's a leveraged fund is what it is. This asset is just massive. You see here, the discovery of oil in the North Sea gave the country more money than it could spend. They put all of its excess income into a national pension fund. This fund is called the Government Pension Fund Global. Now let's contrast that to what the geniuses in the United States have done for us here. And we have Social Security, and they get 6%, I think it is, from your payroll, plus the employer puts in another 6%. So they've got all this money coming in every month. And what do they do with it? Well, they use the money to pay people that are on Social Security. So a chunk of it goes out. And then if there's any left, they lend it. The fund lends it to the government, which spends it. So that money that's surplus money that's coming in, unlike Norway, where it's invested in stocks and bonds that appreciate, and real estate, in our case, it gets spent on FEMA and bridges to nowhere in Gaza, and the Department of Education and other, forms of common good, so-called. In fact, it just goes down the drain. And we're gonna have to pause. I have to pause here. My apologies. That was the UPS delivery. I work from my home, so I rely on UPS to deliver and pick up items. So in effect, the government borrows that surplus money from the Social Security fund, and they pay interest. The question is, well, how much interest do they pay? Well, here you see it. In contrast to Norway's fund, which went through the roof, our government was generously paying Social Security recipients or aspiring recipients, effective rate of 2.4%, 2.4%, 2.5%, 2.6%, 2.8%. In other words, peanuts, going back as far as I can see on that money. And that money is spent, so it's not like it's available tomorrow if it was needed. The government would have to take it out of their, budget to to pay it back. And it's almost like a Ponzi scheme here. This is why you hear talk about Social Security going bankrupt. What that means is there's a point, especially now when there are fewer people working and more people on Social Security because of the aging demographic. There's a point where even if all of these obligations are honored, right, the government pays this money back to Social Security plus this interest, which is minuscule, where the fund doesn't have enough money to pay out all of the people on Social Security, and that doomsday date has moved around, but it's in our lifetimes. Various estimates have been made, and the chickens are going to come home to roost on this scheme sooner or later. So again, government, this is a colossal failure in the making, absolutely colossal. The amounts of money here are staggering. And the United States has not been wise as Norway has in preparing for the future. We have oil too. Where did that oil money go? The government took their share. If it's federal lease money, they get lease money. If it's not, they still get taxation on the profits, and they spent it on the common good, quote unquote, which we all know what that means. So yeah, that now, it's easy to criticize, and people might say, well, what's your plan, Mr. Politically incorrect old white man? What's your plan? What would you do? Well, I've already said that we need to prune back the government bureaucracy by reducing the number of states to about 10, the number of counties to about 500, and the number of congressional districts to about the same number to reflect the speed of transportation and the internet, telecommunications advances, et cetera, et cetera. And most, if you look at the numbers, most government employees are at the local and state levels, not at the federal level, even though the federal government does have some massive bureaucracies. The 50 states far eclipse the federal government in terms of their number of employees. I think something like 90% of the government employees in the United States are at the state and local levels. So that's why we need to focus on the number of states and the number of counties, and we need to basically trim back, downsize, right size, whatever word you want to use, to get the leaky bucket to stop leaking, or at least to minimize the leaks in the leaky bucket, and to cut down on the boondoggles and Gaza pontoons, whatever that crazy scheme was, by having government close to the people, so people can protest or call or visit their representatives in person and say, what the heck are you doing with my money? You need to cut that out. And that might help some too. We still will have a federal government under my proposal, though. And so the question is, how do we tax people, and how do we fund the federal government? How do we fund the states in a more sustainable fashion? Because the path we're on right now is not sustainable. And I do have some ideas, and I'm going to put them on the table now. They may not be the best ideas, but or they may not be the ultimate ideas, but I think they're an improvement. So I think the states should have the right to tax income, sales, whatever they want to tax. Each state can tax by a different philosophy or different scheme, as I've mentioned. And then if people don't like it, they'll move to another state. So there you have it. The states now become the principal collector of revenue. The states then agree amongst themselves to pass through a pro rata percentage of their total revenue collection to the federal government. So let's say they all get together and say, well, we're going to put the federal government on a plan where we give them 25% of all the money each state collects and no more, and they just have to make do with that. If that turns out to be insufficient, then we'll revisit that number. But for the moment, we're starting off at 25%. The federal government, the flip side of that is the federal government loses its ability to borrow money. So no more borrowing. The money that has been borrowed will obviously have to be paid back, which means the federal government is going to need, at least in the short term, additional sources of money. And the obvious candidate is tariffs. You've heard a lot of discussion about tariffs in the current political campaigns. And some countries, for example, the Bahamas, fund their government almost entirely from import duties. And the federal government started off that way. Initially, the federal government was funded entirely by import duties. Federal income tax was something that came along later. So the federal government, given that its mandate will continue to be the control of the borders of the United States, is the agency that will collect import duties. And those import duties will then flow into the federal coffers. And what we will effectively be saying is that people that want to use or buy or consume imported stuff will pay extra, and that money will go to the federal government. People that are more patriotic or not as what is the word, extravagant, will buy local, and they will not be funding the federal government through that mechanism. So I think tariffs are a viable source of revenue for the federal government. At the moment, there's not enough money there to fund the federal government in its entirety, far from it, and there certainly isn't enough money for them to deal with the massive amount of debt that they've accumulated. I'm going to further state that the only way to deal with the massive mountain of debt that we've accumulated is through a reorganization similar to what would happen to a corporation that got into this situation, where that debt obligation would be exchanged for equity and effectively discharged. So the question is, equity in what? Well, we saw Norway, so I'm proposing that we in the United States will establish a sovereign wealth fund, which will be funded by designated revenue streams, including some or all of the tariffs collected. And that sovereign wealth fund will issue shares, just like a mutual fund, to not only to the citizenry that are, and I say citizenry in the strict sense of the word, they're not distributing any to the illegals or even to the resident aliens. You have to be a citizen in order to get a share or some share in that federal sovereign wealth fund. The debt holders, including foreign debt holders, such as foreign governments and pension funds and banks and what have you, will receive shares in the sovereign wealth fund in lieu of their debt. Their debt will be discharged, and that formula will be worked out in the same way that it's worked out in a bankruptcy proceeding. Initially, the debtors will get the vast majority of the shares in the sovereign wealth fund, and any money in the Social Security, Medicare surplus will go into the sovereign wealth fund, and citizens will be awarded shares. They will earn shares in the sovereign wealth fund according to how long they have contributed to the system. You get nothing basically for the first 20 years you work, for example, and after that you might get to participate in the sovereign wealth fund and you kind of vest in the same way that you would vest in a corporate pension scheme. If you're a good, hardworking, productive citizen that's, you know, that's been paying taxes and keeping your nose clean for a number of years. So you would vest and you would become a shareholder in this sovereign wealth fund. Over time, that will be worth a substantial amount of money, assuming that the investments it makes are wise. And the sovereign wealth fund will, at some point, start paying dividends, just like a mutual fund, and that dividend money will go to the holders of debt that gave up their bonds, and that will be their, that's how we will discharge the debt. The citizenry, when they get older, will own shares in the sovereign wealth fund, and that's how they will pay for their old age. That will take the place of Social Security, which will be bankrupt by then. It'll take the place of Medicare. You will receive a check, monthly check from the sovereign wealth fund that reflects how long you've contributed and reflects how well the fund is doing, and you will buy whatever you need in your old age: groceries, gasoline, heating oil, healthcare, insurance, whatever you need, you will pay for out of that, because the way you thought you were going to get paid, Social Security won't exist anymore, or Medicare will not exist anymore either. And yeah, that will be, by definition, a sustainable system, because it cannot go bankrupt. There's no scenario under which it can go bankrupt. The only thing that it can happen is people end up with less or perhaps more than they would have under the old system. And they have to provide through their own private investments, savings, they have to provide to cover the gap. So that, in essence, is chapter 2 of my plan to fix the mess that we're in. And it needs, obviously, a lot of refinement and specifics, but I think if we do not start now preparing, we are going to end up in a massive dislocation, to put it mildly, that will involve some levels of violence and cruelty. My plan might sound harsh, but believe me, the alternative is harsher. Okay, so there you have it in a nutshell. Politically incorrect old white guy's vision for government in the United States. 10 states, federal government restricted to strictly the limits of the Constitution, all entitlements managed by the states. Each state taxes people as they see fit. The states fund the federal government to fund defense and what have you. The debt is just discharged. Medicare and Social Security are replaced by a sovereign wealth fund that all citizens and only citizens participate in. So if you're a permanent resident, you need to become a citizen. Otherwise, you're on your own, buddy. If you're an illegal, you can come here and work, and that's fine if you can find a job, but you're not going to get any handouts, whether, while you're working or when you're retired. So better save whatever you make, send it back to wherever you came from, and be willing to go back there when you're done. And maybe that government will take care of you. This government can't take care of everybody. It's just not feasible. So let's see if that puts the cat among the pigeons. I think it's more than a little controversial, but those are my thoughts. And if you don't like them, well, you're free to come up with your own solution. So far, I don't see anybody with a global plan. I don't see anyone with a global plan. I hear people saying, well, we'll give you $25,000 so you can maybe enjoy the American dream, and we'll not tax your tips. That's all nibbling around the edges while Rome burns. Nobody is coming up with an integrated vision for how we're going to move on. And that's what I'm trying to do here. And your comments are welcome, and please do have a government-free day.